The village of Elmsbrook slept under a blanket of mist, its cobblestone streets empty and silent. The only sound cutting through the night was the deep, mournful toll of the church bell, a sound that shouldn't have been there. St. Armand's Hollow, the ancient church perched on the hill, had no bell ringer. Not since Old Man Harker died in 1957. Yet, for the past 6 months, like clockwork, the bell rang at exactly 3 a.m. At first, the villagers shrugged it off. "Must be the wind," they muttered over pints at the tavern. But when the priest himself, Father Joseph, locked the bell tower and cut the rope, only for the bell to keep ringing, the whispers turned to fear. Doors were bolted shut at night. Parents pulled their children inside before sunset. And still, every night the bell rang. Clara Renner hadn't believed any of it when she first returned to Elmsbrook. She'd left the village years ago, chasing stories as a journalist in the city. But her mother's illness had brought her back, and now, trapped in the slow, suffocating rhythm of village life, she found herself drawn to the mystery. It wasn't just the bell. Strange things had started happening. Old Mrs. Darrow's prize sheep dropped dead overnight, their bodies untouched but their eyes wide with terror. Children woke up standing in the churchyard, their nightclothes damp with dew, with no memory of how they got there. And then there were the dreams. The same one, whispered among the villagers like a secret. A woman in white, kneeling beneath the altar, her sobs echoing through the empty church. Father Joseph, his hands trembling as he poured Clara a cup of tea, had looked at her with tired eyes. "It's her," he said. "Agnes. She's trying to tell us something." Clara didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in stories, and this one was begging to be told. The first night Clara spent inside St. Armand's Hollow, the cold crept into E. Her bones like an unwelcome guest. She had set up her camera near the bell tower, its lens trained on the frayed remains of the rope that should have been useless. Yet every night the bell still rang. Father Joseph had insisted on staying with her, his wrinkled hands clutching a rosary as he muttered prayers under his breath. The church was darker than Clara remembered, the stained glass windows swallowing the moonlight instead of reflecting it, casting eerie shapes across the pews. She checked her watch. 2:58 a.m. The air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then, right on time, the bell began to move. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the massive bronze bell swing violently, its deafening toll shaking the dust from the rafters. But the rope didn't move. There was no wind, no explanation. Just the bell, ringing on its own, as if an invisible hand had struck it. The camera captured everything. The empty tower, the motionless rope, the bell moving as though possessed. But when Clara played back the footage later, her blood turned to ice. Beneath the bell's thunderous peals, the audio picked up something else. A whisper, so faint it could have been mistaken for static. She turned up the volume, her fingers trembling. The voice was unmistakable. A woman's broken plea, repeating the same words over and over. "Let me speak." Father Joseph crossed himself, his face ashen. "She's getting louder," he murmured. Clara didn't sleep that night. Instead, she scoured the church records, her flashlight flickering over crumbling pages. That was when she found the first mention of Agnes Mallory, a nun who had vanished in 1883 after accusing the bishop of an unspeakable crime. The official record called her hysterical, but Clara knew better. Women who spoke up were often silenced, and Agnes, it seemed, had been screaming into the void for over a century. Clara's fingers traced the brittle pages of the church ledger. The ink faded to ghosts of words, the parchment smelling of damp and neglect. The entry from 1883 was brief, but damning. Agnes Mallory, a nun of St. Armand's Hollow, had accused Bishop Laurent of sacrilege, claiming he'd hidden something beneath the altar, something unholy. The bishop, a man of towering influence, had declared her mad, and within weeks, Agnes vanished. The ledger noted her disappearance with bureaucratic indifference. Sister Agnes Mallory, having succumbed to fits of delirium, was removed from the parish for her own welfare. But Clara knew the truth lingered in the gaps. No asylum records existed. No grave. Just whispers, like the one caught on her camera. The next morning, she dragged Father Joseph to the church basement, where cobwebs clung to the stone walls like veils. The priest resisted, his voice trembling. "What lies beneath this church is not for the living," he warned, but Clara was done with warnings. Behind a rusted iron grate they found a staircase swallowed by darkness, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and something metallic, old blood, maybe, or rust. The steps groaned under their weight as they descended, Clara's flashlight cutting through the black to reveal a low, vaulted chamber. The crypt. It shouldn't have existed. No blueprints mentioned it, yet there it was, its entrance sealed, with chains so thick they looked like they'd been forged to cage a beast. The chains were cold, impossibly cold, and Clara's breath fogged in the air despite the summer heat above. But the most unsettling detail? The chains weren't fastened from the outside. They'd been locked from the inside as if someone, or something, had sealed themselves in. Father Joseph staggered back, crossing himself. "God protect us," he breathed. Clara, though, stepped closer. The crypt's stone bore scratches, deep and frantic, near the lock. Not the marks of time. The marks of fingers. The chains broke with a scream of rust, and the crypt door groaned open as if resisting them, the stale air rushing out in a sigh that smelled of old bones and damp stone. Clara's flashlight trembled in her grip as the beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small square chamber where the walls were not smooth but carved, covered in frantic, uneven markings, words and symbols scratched over and over as if by desperate hands. The skeleton lay curled in the corner, wrapped in the tattered remains of a nun's habit, the fabric brittle with age and stained with something dark. Clutched in its bony fingers was a small, rusted bell, its surface pitted with time, but still, bearing the faint etchings of crosses, the same design as the great bell in the tower above. The sight of it sent a jolt through Clara's chest. This was Agnes. She hadn't been taken away. She had been buried alive. The walls told the rest of the story. The carvings weren't random. They were a message, a warning, gouged into the stone with what must have been broken fingernails and sheer, terrified will. She rang the bell to warn the living, but they silenced her below. Now the dead call back. Clara's throat tightened as she traced the words, her fingers coming away dusty. Father Joseph had gone pale, his lips moving in silent prayer, but Clara's mind was racing. Agnes had tried to warn them. About what? Then she saw it. A leather-bound journal, miraculously intact, tucked beneath the skeleton's ribs. The pages crackled as she opened it. The ink still dark, the handwriting tight and hurried. Agnes had written of visions, dreams of fire, of the village burning, of screams swallowed by smoke. She had believed the church was the cause. Not the building itself, but what was hidden beneath it. A relic. Something the bishop had brought back from his travels. Something he had sealed away beneath the altar because even he feared it. It listens, Agnes had written. It waits, and when the bell tolls on its own, it means it has begun to wake. Clara's blood ran cold. The bell had been ringing for months. How long did they have? The storm hit before they could even climb. Back up the crypt stairs, the sky splitting open with a thunderclap so loud it shook the church's ancient stones. Rain hammering against the stained glass like fists demanding to be let in. Clara barely noticed the downpour soaking through her clothes as she ran toward the altar. Agnes's journal clutched against her chest like a shield. The words, "beneath the altar," screaming in her mind louder than the storm. Father Joseph shouted. After her, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when the pieces were finally falling into place. The altar was heavy, its marble surface cold and unyielding, but desperation gave her strength as she pushed against it, her muscles burning until, with a grating scrape, it shifted just enough to reveal a hidden compartment beneath, a space, too deliberate to be accidental. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet, was a small stone box, its surface carved with symbols that made Clara's vision swim when she looked at them too long, twisting, serpentine shapes that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. The moment her fingers brushed the box, the temperature in the church plummeted, their breath fogging the air in thick clouds, and somewhere deep in the walls, a low, shuddering groan echoed, like the building itself was in pain. Father Joseph stumbled back, his face ashen, but Clara couldn't let go, the box humming against her palms as if something inside it were alive. The journal had warned about opening it, but the storm, the bell, the crypt, none of this would stop unless they faced whatever Agnes had died trying to expose. Her hands shook as she pried the lid loose, the seal breaking with a hiss of trapped air, and then, the moment the stone box opened, the air in the church turned to ice, a wave of unnatural cold so intense it burned Clara's lungs with every breath, her fingers numbing as she stared into the small, dark cavity of the relic. Inside, nestled, in a bed of blackened cloth, was a human finger bone, yellowed with age, the knuckle joint grotesquely swollen and twisted, as if it had belonged to someone who had died in agony. But it wasn't just a bone. Something was wrong with it. The longer Clara looked, the more she felt it. A slow, sickening pulse, like the thing was still alive, still breathing in some unholy way. The walls of the church groaned again, louder. This time, dust shaking loose from the rafters as the ground beneath them trembled. And then, silence. A silence so deep and heavy it pressed against Clara's eardrums like a physical weight. The storm outside had stopped. The wind was gone. Even the ever-present creaks of the old building had vanished. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, from the crypt below, a sound. A slow, wet dragging, like something heavy being pulled across stone. Father Joseph's face drained of all color, his lips moving in a silent prayer, but Clara couldn't look away from the bone. Because now, in the absolute stillness, she could hear it too. A whisper, not from the crypt, not from the walls, but from the relic itself. A voice, ancient and broken, threading directly into her mind. "You should not have opened the box." The candle flames guttered and died, plunging the church into darkness, and in that blackness the bell tower erupted into motion again. The great bronze bell clanging with such force that the sound was less a toll and more a scream that shook the walls, that rattled Clara's teeth, that echoed through the village like a death knell. And beneath it all, beneath the chaos and the terror, the dragging sound grew louder, closer. The darkness in the church became something alive, something thick and suffocating that clung to Clara's skin like wet tar as the dragging sound from the crypt grew louder, each scrape of whatever was coming sending jagged spikes of terror up her spine. The bone in the box had begun to glow now, a sickly greenish light that pulsed in time with the bell's unnatural tolling, casting long, wavering shadows that twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist. Elongated fingers, gaping mouths, hollow, eyes that watched from the darkness. Father Joseph collapsed to his knees, his prayers turning to choked sobs as the temperature dropped so suddenly that frost crackled across the pews, the very air crystallizing with each panicked breath. Clara wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to throw the cursed relic as far as she could, but her body refused to obey, locked in place by some unseen force as the dragging reached the top of the crypt stairs and then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound, a terrible, waiting silence that stretched Clara's nerves to breaking point. Then the bell tolled one final time, a sound so immense it seemed to split the world in two, and the church doors blew open with a force that shattered the remaining stained glass, the shards hanging suspended in the air like glittering teeth. And there, framed in the doorway, stood Agnes. Not the skeleton from the crypt, but the woman as she must have been in life. Her nun's habit pristine white, her face peaceful except for the eyes. Eyes that were black pits of infinite darkness. Eyes that held the screaming terror of being buried alive for over a century. She didn't speak, didn't need to, because suddenly Clara understood everything. The relic wasn't just some cursed object, it was a seal, and Agnes had been its guardian, walled up alive to contain what lay beneath, and now that seal was broken. The glowing bone in the box crumbled to dust, and as it did, the ground beneath the church began to crack open with a sound like 1,000 bones snapping, tendrils of something unspeakable rising from the fissures as Agnes's form began to dissolve into mist, her final expression not of anger but of sorrow, sorrow that her warning had come too late. The last thing Clara saw before the darkness took her was the journal page from her dream, its words burning themselves into her vision. If the bell rings again, do not come. What lies beneath has awakened. And as consciousness slipped away, she realized with dawning horror that somewhere in the distance, beneath the screams of the villagers and the rending of the earth, she could still hear it. The bell, ringing once more, this time not from the tower, but from deep, deep below.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.